All right, YouTube, this is more of an urgent news piece than I usually cover. It relates to Fukushima. Normally, I just try to educate people with YouTube. This is more of a public service announcement, which I know I've never liked telling people what to do on my YouTube videos, so I won't do that, but I'm going to make some suggestions. Right now, and there's a link in the description, it appears that the radiation from Fukushima has increased drastically over the last 72 hours or so. Uh, for the last week or so, there have been reports of heavy steam coming from Unit 3. They think now, TEPCO covered up the release at first, of course, because they're a bunch of assholes. It looks like some fuel pellets or rods or something fell into the spent fuel pool that was still in Unit 3, Reactor 3, and has caused a recriticality. It's possible that this is just a smaller event, but it's worth assuming the worst just because you don't want to be ingesting hot particles, which are little particulates of radioactive matter. They can get lodged in the lungs. They can persist for many decades and cause lung cancer. Of course, the iodine from any sort of fallout, any sort of new fallout anyway, can cause problems with the thyroid. My recommendation here, because it's possible that there's a recriticality currently in the works, is assume that the fuel pool is probably compromised, and for the next week or so, people probably, especially on the West Coast and the west of the Rockies, shouldn't be going outside any more than they have to. If you're at all able to, if you've got a water filtration system, even a Brita filter is better than nothing for your water, because let's face it, the FDA raised safe standards for drinking water so that radiation alarms wouldn't constantly go off. That it follows people essentially, especially if it's raining or snowing and those particles, this radioactive material is falling down to a lower elevation into the ground or whatever. You probably should not be going outside any more than you have to. If you're in a car, you're probably more protected than, if you're out in the open. But certainly don't let your kids go out and play in the snow for the next week or so, because this radiation, and depending on what source you go to, this radiation is already hitting the West Coast or will be very shortly. I recommend people stay indoors. If you've got potassium iodide pills, take them, 24 hours from now or something. This will flush your thyroid with quote-unquote good iodine and keep radioactive iodine from really affecting your thyroid. People east of the Rockies, probably a few days from now, they'll probably want to spend a week of limited outdoor activities. For the next week or so, I don't plan to really go out much because this radioactive release is potentially quite large in size. If this is a recriticality, the problem is this, and we saw this with Chernobyl, the primary meltdown spewed all sorts of radioactive goodies all over the upper atmosphere, which is still probably descending to the ground to this day. This steam that's coming out, if it is from the fuel pool, is all full of radioactive iodine, cesium, strontium, all the bad stuff you don't really want in your body. If you're exposed, if you're outside and you're not wearing a hazmat suit essentially and a gas mask, you're being continuously exposed. And they've already said, and this is from ENE News, I don't have the article pulled up, so I'll try to put it in the description if I can find it. There was some evidence to suggest that hot particles are already in certain people on the West Coast who didn't know that Fukushima had a specifically bad meltdown until days after it was already too late. You do not want hot particles in your lungs. You do not want to be out in the rain absorbing, potentially this radioactive iodine. So people should stay indoors if possible. If you're going outdoors, literally any form of filtration is better than nothing. Even probably just wearing waterproof clothing if you're going out in the rain is probably better than nothing, at least a little. Unless you have a gas mask or at least like a surgical mask or something, you probably shouldn't be going outside for extended periods to do any unnecessary work. Of course, the problem with a meltdown and the radiation coming here is that the symptoms of being exposed to it are not going to be evident for some years down the road. people who are ingesting hot particles into their lungs today aren't going to show symptoms until perhaps a decade down the road, when people start getting lung cancer and emphysema and all of these other bad things that you don't want. People who are being exposed to the radioactive iodine, some of them are already showing symptoms, which shows that they got quite a substantial dose. Others, probably many tens or hundreds of thousands of people who are exposed, won't show symptoms for a longer period. You're going to see an increase in cancers and birth defects and all sorts of things like that. People should take action now to limit their exposure, not because they're suddenly going to keel over in the street because they're overwhelmed by radiation, but because when you're older, you don't want lung cancer. You don't want, cesium building up in your muscles and causing problems there. You don't want strontium replacing calcium in your bones. Certainly, you don't want to end up with leukemia. That's just a friendly suggestion to people who happen to be living in the Americas, not just the United States. If you're living in Canada, same thing. And Alaska certainly gets the brunt of everything. Alaska and British Columbia get the brunt of everything from Fukushima. People living in Mexico, if you're living on the west coast of the Americas, you're being more exposed to this material because potentially a lot of it is falling in that area as a result of precipitation and never even making it to the east. Over here, we did see increased background radiation, but it was nowhere near what you saw on the west coast. So right now, as we speak, Fukushima may be undergoing another criticality. The fuel pool in reactor 3, which is already severely damaged because the whole thing blew up, is assumed to be compromised. It's assumed that it's possibly undergoing a criticality as we speak right now. There's steam coming from the unit. There's been intermittent steam coming from it for the last week. There were even some events of a similar nature for months. So take care, protect yourself. If you do have potassium iodide, hopefully you know how to use it and when. If you don't, hopefully you have water filtration, at least like a Brita filter. Activated carbon supposedly will remove certain alpha particles from the mix, which is good. Other than that, simply limit your exposure to the elements outside whenever possible when this is happening. Of course, it takes several days for Fukushima radiation to actually get here. As an aside, we now have actual experts agreeing that the radiation is beginning to affect wildlife here in the Americas. And here's another one that I'll post from E&E News. The LA Times reported on this. Bald eagles right now are getting paralyzed, having seizures, and keeling over here in the West Coast and in Utah and in Idaho and places like that. And they think it might be due to Fukushima's radiation. Remember, bioaccumulation. I mentioned DDT before. Someone said, well, that was overblown. So just keep in mind that basic principle, that the grasses and so forth get mildly radioactive. The rodents and shit eat that and get more radioactive. Then the eagles and birds of prey eat those rodents, and they're getting a dose of magnitude higher. That's why they're having problems. Sea lions have been having the exact same symptoms in the water for months. And now it's starting to affect coastal wildlife on land and in the air. And the reason for that, of course, bioaccumulation, and this is my own theory, I'm not sure if it's substantiated by any actual science, would probably happen at a quicker pace in the water because it's getting spread around more. The nutrients are absorbed by microorganisms more readily within that particular substrate of seawater. So please protect yourself. For your posterity, you don't want your sperm becoming deformed. You don't want your eggs getting fucked up. You certainly, above all, don't want hot particles lodged in your lungs. So a little bit of an urgent update. Had I known about this before, I've been keeping up to date on Fukushima, but sometimes the sources are ambiguous or unsubstantiated, so unfortunately I had to wait till now. I would have made a video several days ago had I known that this was going on. But for those on the West Coast, now is the time to start taking those steps to limit your exposure for at least the next week or so to the outside world. And it could be that Unit 3 could undergo a supercriticality and blow up for all we know. We're not sure. This is an untested scenario we're currently going through. This is worse than Chernobyl. At this point, anyone claiming otherwise does not know what they're talking about or they're being paid to post. on the internet to sort of calm people's fears. But when you've got eagles dropping out of the sky with paralysis and having seizures, and you've got that same thing happening in the ocean, and you've got the same thing happening, you've got polar bears covered in sores, you've got whales beaching themselves all over the Pacific, you've got oarfish washing up, you've got mass die-offs, you've got debris coating the sea floor, dead plankton and small fish essentially melting, starfish melting and dying for no apparent reason. You can't reconcile all of these different die-offs, all of these different maladies by saying, oh, we coincidentally had dozens and dozens of different viruses affecting dozens and dozens of different animal families at the exact same time. It does not make sense. It is due to radiation. At this point, that can be taken most likely to be certain. If it's causing that kind of problem with a species as large as an eagle or a sea lion, potentially that could probably hurt humans. The only reason why people probably aren't already seizing and keeling over is because a lot of the beef that we eat comes from South America, which is far less affected than North America. But people, be safe. Do not go outside if you don't need to for the next week. Because even though you won't keel over right away, you could get cancer 10 years down the line. Any limit on the exposure, even having a thin wall between you and the fallout, is better than nothing. It is survivable. It probably won't cause problems in the majority of the population anyway, but the less exposure that you have, the better your odds are. It's something that it's just like smoking, and I'm going to be a hypocrite here. If you're not smoking, you probably shouldn't start, because even if you don't have a heart attack, even if you don't have a stroke, you're still going to be, as an aggregate, more prone to such problems. That's about all.